Hello and welcome to the value of Kant's critique of pure reason to an epistemology of history. Immanuel Kant is one of the most significant philosophers of the last 300 years. His thought is to a large extent responsible for the so-called epistemological turn between the 18th and the 19th centuries, the move away from grand theories of metaphysics to the schools of German idealism and phenomenology. The critique of pure reason is both an assessment of the possibilities and limitations of metaphysics and Kant's attempt to reconcile the major philosophical schools of the 17th and 18th centuries, the rationalists, those who advocate for deductive reasoning, a priori knowledge, such as René Descartes, and the empiricists, the preceding segment of philosophers towards, you can say, a modern so-called theory of scientific method, inductive reasoning, such as David Hume. Kant was constructing the basis of a theory of scientific knowledge, also in the wake of the monads of Gottfried Leibniz and the deterministic universal theories of Newton, every action conditioning all reactions. So how is all of this relevant to history? I was fortunate in having been exposed to the critique at a relatively early age, despite not being made at all aware of its significance to my subject of history. I had to intuit its significance. Indeed, the best way to describe how I came to utilize Kant is by reading Kant, which we'll get to in a moment. Paradoxically, in my view, Kant describes the foundations of both the essence and the limitations of historical knowledge at a level that speaks above the heads of most historians. And I don't mean that as an insult. Kant is the author of his own demise in this respect. I will often use certain terms that have a perceived philosophical currency, though I believe them to be necessary components to the reading of history in general. Ontology, for example, is a word I will use because I believe its meaning to be relatively ubiquitous, i.e., systems of knowledge categorization. Rather than simply defining the word, I will often use it in the context of creating and critiquing categories on a case-by-case basis. Historicism is another term that I use, though I often define it each and every time I use it, even though it is a relatively straightforward word, meaning objects both physical and mental, situated in and conditioned by space and time. Some would argue determined rather than conditioned, which is why I feel the need to clarify my position each time. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge, a topic any historian should entertain in dealing with the why of history and not simply the how. But then again, you can ask, what even is knowledge? The most common definition used today is JTB, justified true belief. But what does justify, truth, or belief mean in that context? Kant will be very instructive here. But the reading of Kant is predicated on the understanding of grandiose ontologies. I think it's perfectly understandable that someone who wants to do a study of D-Day does not want to preface his study with interrogations of transcendental idealism, synthetic unity, and the supersensible substratum. And no, I'm not joking. Nor am I joking when I say that these are fundamental concepts for the understanding of Kant. Notice how I have never used these terms across all the streams and the videos I've done on this channel. I don't mean to denigrate Kant either. Writing in German with an advanced knowledge of Latin, but no English, it should be mentioned, there is a unique creative power expressed by the logical structure of his crafted language. Nevertheless, it is the concise version of the arguments made by Kant that have seeped into my various methodologies, and that is sufficient for my own purposes. It is here I need to establish the parameters for this relatively condensed stream. This is not a history of Kantianism, i.e. a history of ideas. Furthermore, this is not a philosophical appraisal of the critique, nor am I even saying that everything in the critique has value. Rather, this stream is acknowledging a debt I owe to the critique, giving Kant his fair due. This in view of a far more confrontational discussion on Kant I'm hosting this weekend, whether it is possible for Kant to yield any value to a reactionary mode of thought. My first consideration was to begin that conversation with this summary of important quotations from the critique. only to find that it would be incongruous with the flow of that argumentation. That, and I don't believe it's fair for someone to plod through an hour of epistemology to reach a stream. So without further ado, the critique, the original Meiklejohn translation of the second edition that was the classical English standard for nearly a century. This in particular is a quote from the preface to the second edition. When Galileo experimented with balls of a definite weight on the in-aligned plane, when Torricelli caused the air to sustain a weight which he had calculated beforehand to be equal to that of the definite column of water, or when Stahl at a later period converted metals into lime and reconverted lime into metal by the addition of and subtraction of certain elements, a light broke upon all natural philosophers. They learnt that reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design, that it must not be content to follow, as it were, in the long strings of nature, but must proceed in advance with principles of judgment according to unvarying laws, and compel nature to reply to its questions. For accidental observations made according to no preconceived plan cannot be united under a necessary law, but it is this that reason seeks for and requires. It is only the principles of reason which can give to concordant phenomena the validity of laws, and it is only when experiment is directed by these rational principles that it can have any real utility. Reason must approach nature with the view, indeed, of receiving information from it, not, however, in the character of a pupil who listens to all that his master chooses to tell him, but in that of a judge who compels the witness to reply to those questions which he himself thinks fit to propose. The analogy that Kant is using here is obviously in reference to natural sciences, but it's important to understand that on the most fundamental level, despite all the creative applications towards history, and despite, you can say, the very limited parameters for a definite understanding of historical knowledge, history operates from that very same premise, that beautiful way of essentially expressing that it is holding nature as a witness. You have to act as a judge, compel the witness to reply to those questions. The whole idea of reason, there are no accidental observations. History is a construct, as indeed you can say the whole basis of scientific knowledge and laws and science are a construct. There is an intended purpose behind them. In the case of a historian, it is the whole basis of the historical inquiry. It's where the actual word historia comes from in Greek, from Herodotus. That is the whole basis of understanding history. Indeed, if you're going to take the old Rankian phrase to describe the past as it really was, so why should the fundamental precepts of history be so radically, again, at variance with those of the natural sciences? But again, reason, ontology, categories of understanding, a principle that one simply doesn't embark upon a work of history by seeing a whole vast array of historical ephemera and then deciding that that will be a history, because that ultimately says nothing. No, the historian has to imbibe any history with purpose and direction. And that is the fundamental question from which, therefore, we can extract knowledge from it, on the basis that the value of the history is, again, based on its relationship to an objective reality, which it is trying to ascertain. So from its very sort of core principle, we can see that history is, again, applicable in terms of Kantian categories and terminologies. He then goes on to explain the universal problem of pure reason, and this in many ways is the summary of the reason why he decided to embark upon this so-called critique of pure reason. In all the attempts hitherto made to answer the questions which reason is prompted by its very nature, to propose to itself, for example, whether the world had a beginning or had existed from eternity, it is always met with unavoidable contradictions. We must not rest satisfied with the mere natural disposition of the mind to metaphysics, that is, with the existence of the faculty of pure reason, whence indeed some sort of metaphysical system always arises, but it must be possible to arrive at certainty in regard to the question whether we know or not the things of which metaphysics treats. We must be able to arrive at a decision on the subjects of its questions, or on the ability or inability of reason to form any judgment respecting them. and therefore either to extend with confidence the bounds of our pure reason, or to set strictly defined and safe limits to its action. This last question, which arises out of and above the universal problem, will properly run thus: how is metaphysics possible as a science? Thus, the critique of reason leads at last naturally and necessarily to science, and on the other hand, the dogmatical use of reason without criticism leads to a groundless assertion, against which other equally specious claims can always be set, thus ending in unavoidably in skepticism, which is the pitfalls of the rationalists, essentially, that Kant was trying to rescue himself from, and by extension, those who follow in the wake of the critique. Now, this is fundamental because historical knowledge cannot, by its very nature, be metaphysical, because it's always conditioned by surroundings and conditioned in situating the object in place and time. Elsewhere, I've described history as ontology and practice. It is the idea, and it is the idea made manifest in the real world. And so he is embarking upon a study of scientific knowledge that anticipates so much in terms of the understanding of the whole basis and nature of historical knowledge, as in derived out of this criticism of a necessary system of metaphysics. Indeed, it's this whole idea of the expectations and the confidence that can arise from our understanding of knowledge, and the acceptance of certain limits in terms of our own understanding. It's very conducive for various elements of the recent conversations I've had, that even though these topics aren't all done with some sort of grand plan in mind, there is often a crossover in terms of certain ideas from stream to stream. So in the last stream, I was talking about Mircea Eliade and the myth of the eternal return. And one of the issues I had with Eliade was his extreme confidence in terms of his criteria. And I think the whole basis of a system of knowledge that Kant is advocating for, which doesn't arrive in this position of extreme skepticism, places a huge amount of onus upon the scholar, a huge onus in terms of being able to verify the limits of the acceptable scope of knowledge which he is trying to present. And thereby you can say that many historians have taken that and have taken the pusillanimous route, the cowardly route, which is to, I've described it elsewhere as retreating into a cave of hyper-specificity, where the subject seems to have no relation or even relevance beyond the own historian's scope of inquiry. Indeed, when going and reading such disparate figures such as Dante Alighieri, part of the onus and claims for his own system and theory of knowledge was his own creative and intellectual power, the power of genius. And I believe implicit in Kant's whole notion of being able to ascertain knowledge is the role that genius has to play in forming this, what he will later term, and I'll bring up later, the synthetic unity and the manifold of inspirations and ideas to make whole an entire gestalt, a whole system or worldview of knowledge. All of this proceeds, you can say, from the forms of knowledge that come out of a critique of metaphysics. But this is also where I want to, I would say, point out some of my own severe limitations when it comes to my approach of knowledge. Historical knowledge is something which I have endeavored and hope to understand, and Kant is, again, one of these avenues from which I'm able to stab at a notion or a consistent notion of a means of attaining historical knowledge. But there is a reason, say, for example, I will never get involved in theology, biblical exegesis, or trying to entertain really a supreme work of Christian metaphysics and Aristotelian recontextualization, such as St. Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, for the reason I simply believe that my whole brain is conditioned around historically contingent analogies. It's why actually it was very useful for me in terms of being able to explain my positions on Christopher Dawson and Eliade, because their worldviews, essentially their Christian worldviews, were anchored in the carnation, which is in itself a historical event. And so they were able to combine the metaphysical, the transcendent, the sacred, the idea of God, to the physical manifestation of God on earth, who of course is the Christ. This isn't something, of course, that Kant has any interest in really discovering, because, of course, he represents the epistemological term. the move, you can say, towards, ironically, a form of phenomenology that is a form of extreme skepticism and a post-religious sentiment. But nevertheless, I think there is a value to historical knowledge, a fundamental value and a creative energy to historical knowledge. And simply to say that because it doesn't have the claims of certainty that some claims of metaphysics essentially would try and put out there, that therefore all historical knowledge is simply a nonsense. And Kant is really, again, a means of trying to reconcile the validity of certain aspects of historical knowledge. We then go on to the subsection, idea and division of a particular science, under the name of a critique of pure reason. Reason is the faculty which furnishes us with the principles of knowledge a priori, that being knowledge we perceive before experience. Hence, pure reason is the faculty which contains the principles of cognizing anything absolutely a priori. In other words, without reason and without the ability to form concepts in our brains, then any sort of understanding of a world before experience is impossible by that very metric. An organon of pure reason would be a compendium of those principles according to which alone all pure cognitions a priori can be obtained. The completely extended application of such an organon would afford a system of pure reason. As this, however, is demanding a great deal, and it is yet doubtful whether any extension of our knowledge be here possible, or if so, in what cases we can regard a science of mere criticism of pure reason, its sources and limits, as the propedeutic to a system of pure reason. Such a science must not be called a doctrine, but only a critic of pure reason, and its use in regard to speculation would be only negative, not to enlarge the bounds of it, but to purify our reason and to shield it against error. Propedeutic, which comes from the Greek, which means the preparatory education. Indeed, you can say that reason as a form of preparatory education is quite a nice way of phrasing again the beginning, the inklings, the intuition towards concepts before trying to realize them. And again, emphasis there to purify reason and to shield it against error. Trying to come up with the whole notion of pure reason and to categorize it, to situate it within real things existing in time and space, historical events, historical personalities. So, for example, what use essentially is a grand, theory of historical knowledge? I don't know. Let me just say, inventing, say, for example, a pure fiction. Let's say J.R. Tolkien writes another sort of a fantasy novel. Even a work of pure fantasy would require, again, an element of understanding or inductive reasoning before a work of pure fantasy is created, with history that demands essentially on empirical validity, or even more so. And so, again, the whole notion that history can be known a priori, that it could be ready formed before, again, ingesting the matter of the world, is completely nonsense. It runs contrary to the whole notion of which we can receive any knowledge historically. He then goes on to explain this further in his chapter, The Transcendental Aesthetic. In whatsoever mode, or by whatsoever means our knowledge may relate to objects, it is at least quite clear that the only manner in which it immediately relates to them is by means of an intuition. I'm of the not so controversial opinion to say that if you don't have a level of imagination or a level of intuition, an ability to be able to form connections and reach patterns with some reference point in reality with relatively consistent success, then you're not going to be a very good historian, unfortunately. And it's again interesting that it is a category which Kant places so much emphasis on, the whole basis of intuition, rather than simply, again, this abstracted notion of a theory of pure knowledge. Because for reference, when we're talking about the idea of reason and anything beyond reason, equating to skepticism, this is referring back to René Descartes, who came up with the idea of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But beyond that, he had to deal with the whole idea that there is no reality beyond the thinking self. that there is perhaps, again, some form of demiurge, if I'm going to use some sort of Gnostic parallel, which is withholding the true nature of the world from us, an evil demon, in other words. But again, for Kant, that sort of line of reasoning where everything needs to be defined a priori essentially leads to a position of extreme skepticism. And again, I do believe it leads to a form of nihilism, that there is no validity in the external plane. So it's the back and forth essentially between our ability to reason and our ability to engage with the real world that again helps us avoid the pitfalls of an extreme skepticism, which leads to a form of nihilism, that there is no objective reality, there is no value in anything. Indeed, it's not just the whole basis of historical knowledge for Kant, it's also the value of morality within the system that's of such importance to Kant, and is something which I have a lot to say about when it comes to critiquing, you can say, the political postures that are, you can say, emblematic of someone like Kant. To this, as the indispensable groundwork, all thought points. Again, groundwork, a basis, a foundation. And again, it's why I say that Kant is both foundational to an epistemology of history in order for any historian to really think of the why, and yet the whole basis of this philosophy, indeed the whole notion of trying to engage a historian in philosophy, will often be, again, something which may not only be something they try to avoid, but something that may never even occur to them. But an intuition can take place only insofar as the object is given to us. This again is only possible to man, at least, on condition that the object affect the mind in a certain manner. And again, this is where we're going to get into the subjective nature of certain aspects of knowledge, the subjectivity, intersubjectivity, objectivity distinction, which is so important for historical knowledge. That, again, it's not just a passive reception of knowledge, which you can say elements of the denigrated and primitive form of empiricism. I don't really want to go on a rant about how much I hate David Hume, but for me at least, Kant is one of these figures who I'm happy to engage in terms of his whole philosophical understanding, and not essentially be left with a complete misapprehension about how the world works. When reading Hume, I'm left exactly with that aspect of misapprehension. And so I think, again, Kant is coming from a place that Humeanism, empiricism, the whole idea that we can receive knowledge passively through our senses, which takes its extreme form in the tabula rasa, which is human beings, the blank slate, which by extension would mean there can be no such thing as intuition, and there can be no such thing really as a priori reasoning. Again, would also lead us into a position of not just extreme skepticism, but it's one of these ideas, I believe, that lends to a theory that there is no fundamental distinction between peoples, and an idea of extreme cognitive equality between everyone, which can lead people to some rather bizarre speculations and theories about how the human mind works. The capacity for receiving representations, receptivity, through the mode in which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. So he goes again at great lengths, goes to great lengths to describe his terms, because they do, again, for him, form a grand philosophical makeup. You know, this is a philosophy of being. It's not just in the ground. It's in the groundwork for metaphysics. It's in the critique of practical reason, not just a pure reason, but it's also in the grounding of the metaphysic of morals. All of these books, you can say, are in some ways interconnected into this grand philosophy for Kant, and thereby trying to ascertain what he really means by the words such as sensibility, which is the reception of presentations in the mind of the beholder, is so important. It was also quite excruciating for the study of Kant, is also understanding that he himself is not entirely consistent with these words. So again, it's not just taking these categories and understanding them in absolute terms, it's understanding the general application of them, which is how I like to use all terms. Everything has to be case dependent, case sensitive. By means of sensibility, therefore, objects are given to us, and it alone furnishes us with intuitions, by the understanding that they are thought, and from it arise conceptions. Again, the back and forth between the reception of the object, and the reception essentially being a presentation to our minds, which is, again, furnished to us by intuition. The whole thing is, again, a back and forth between the object and that perceiving the object. But all thought must directly or indirectly, by means of certain signs, relate ultimately to intuitions, consequently with us to sensibility, because in no other way can an object be given to us. This is, again, so important to history, because history is the study of human action. It, again, is quite helpful in a way to have a limitation for the scope of history, yet also that's incredibly freeing, because there are so many. Human action encompasses all human thought, and thereby, by extension, all human creativity. And the categories for historical understanding can be as creative as all human endeavors on Earth. But again, it's necessarily humanistic, and Kant's knowledge is focused on the knowledge that human beings can possibly acquire. The counteraction to this, again, would be a knowledge of a God's eye, a view which supersedes all human perceptions and is able to see things, again, in a mode essentially of undifferentiated, unintuited, the Platonic realm of forms in some instances, but also, again, the theory of how the world is presented to God or creation on the other. Kant isn't focused on that aspect of knowledge. He's focused on the human capacity for knowledge. The effect of an object upon the faculty of representation, so far as we're affected by said object, is sensation. That sort of intuition which relates to an object by means of sensation is called an empirical intuition. So again, he's prepared to use the terminology that, again, the empiricists and David Hume uses, but again, he's trying to always contextualize his understanding of it being a back and forth between reason and empiricism, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, in terms of forming a complete understanding of a basis of knowledge, which, in terms of how I would use it, historical knowledge. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is called a phenomenon. Undetermined object of an empirical intuition. Indeed, the whole sort of aspect of, phenomenology coming out of this, the whole sort of basis of a knowledge contained in a phenomenon, or sort of nothing beyond that. Undetermined is, again, it's quite an interesting way of essentially describing it, because if we essentially start as a beginning, the beginning is the phenomenon, and then we can extrapolate all sort of subjective meanings from that. Essentially, phenomenon becomes phenomenology, the study of that phenomenon. It's in history, you can say, I'm thinking of doing a broader subject on the distinctions between conceptual history and phenomenology, and really getting into the meat of the application of these words. But he's using it, you can say, in a very granular sense, which is simply that at the beginning of empirical intuition, we have the phenomenon. That which is the phenomenon corresponds to the sensation, and what Kant refers to it, its matter. But that which affects the content of the phenomenon can be arranged under certain relations I call form. But that in which our sensations are merely arranged, and by which they are susceptible of assuming a certain form, cannot in itself be a sensation. It is then the matter of all phenomena that is given to us a posteriori, after knowledge, after, you say, inference or inductive reasoning, after the fact. The form must lie ready a priori for them in the mind, and consequently can be regarded separately from all sensation. The form, the basis, again, under certain relations, he's trying to form an abstract notion. Again, you can say he's very much sort of relying on Plato, Platonic theory of forms. It's the sort of basis of understanding that we have in mathematics, that mathematical knowledge, in a sense, is a language of being able to comprehend a world that doesn't so neatly, essentially, fit into mathematical categories. So, for example, one can refer to a single table, or on the battlefield, you can say of a battle in antiquity, we can talk about a single soldier. But contained within that notion of one is a whole variation of categories, essentially, that can apply to the soldier. So one can exist separately from sensation. But in terms of my understanding of this, of the phenomenon, all applications of the form can therefore relate to the sensation, but in order to have any concepts, in order to understand the notion of one soldier, it can't always be one soldier in the particular. When we're thinking of a single soldier on a battlefield, it can't be that specific soldier of all times, i.e., let's say, I don't know, a Persian immortal fighting at the Battle of Thermopylae against the Spartans. There has to be a form, again, of a priori knowledge, which allows us to comprehend the thing in the abstract as opposed to the thing in the particular. Such, again, is the basis of a category of a priori form of knowledge before we try and again apply it to historical categories. Objects are quite unknown to us in themselves, and what we call outward objects are nothing else but mere representations of our sensibility, whose form is space, but whose real correlate, the thing in itself, is not known by means of these representations, nor ever can be. What he's essentially referring to here is that we again can understand the representations. We can understand in the abstract what a soldier means, what a king is, what a country is, essentially. But what is the thing in itself? What is that representation? That representation isn't given to us. The only thing essentially you can say from a Christian point of view is that revelation or truth would come in the form of an epiphany, the revelation of God to man. And in the absence of that, in the absence of such a concreted, incarnate version of the truth, everything else has to belong to this realm of form and space, where, again, everything is correlation. Everything is understanding concepts in the mind relative to something. But really, what is that absolute concept? There isn't someone coming us and saying, this is truth for all time, which again is why Kant's whole understanding of knowledge is so humanistic. And it comes again to the point of view which is most important for understanding history and historical objects, which is beyond simply the categories, but the relationship between time and space. And this is coming from his elucidations, transcendental exposition of the conception of time. Time is something real. That is, it is the real form of our internal intuition. In other words, the real form of our internal intuition. You cannot interpret, again, so much of the form or the extent of the object outside of time. You can almost say that really even conceiving of objects or conceiving of categories is always conditioned by the sensation of time. Eternity to us is impossible to comprehend, which again is why it requires a God's eye to situate yourself outside of time to be able to comprehend something in the absence of time or something in the negatory. It therefore has subjective reality in reference to our internal experience. That is, I have really the representation of time and my determinations therein. Again, the subjective inference. So, for example, in front of me, I'm drinking a mug of tea. Everything about my whole conception of the mug and the tea, how much tea is left, the temperature of the temperature of the tea, how nourishing I'm finding it, how soothing it is to my voice as I'm trying to go through these rather complex categories of epistemology. All these things are subjectively determined by my own conception of time and time passing for everyone listening to the stream. Time, therefore, is not to be regarded as an object, but as the mode of representation of myself as an object. And again, if history of anything, it is the mode of the representation of an object in time. That's why I have quite an absolutist understanding of what historicism means, going back to my original definition, which is that historicism is the object, whether it be the mental or the physical, situated in and conditioned by time. I think the issue that he was having to deal with is this, I would say, rather primitive notion that time was an object that could be perceived from without. Time was something concreted and something existing outside of the objects in themselves. And I think, again, why Kant is so fundamental to my own understanding is that no, time is a necessary condition of the objects, of the whole notion of change, and of the way that we are able to interact with these objects, and our whole representation of the objects within our own minds, our own conceptions, our own sensibility. If I could intuit myself or be intuited by another being without this condition of sensibility, then those very determinations which we now represent to ourselves as changes will present to us a knowledge in which the representation of time and consequently of change would not appear. Again, let me just again repeat that for myself, if nothing else. If I could intuit myself or be intuited by another being, again, a whole aspect of history you can say is intersubjectivity, is not simply the being, the self, being able to intuit an idea of the self, but being represented and being able to relate to another human being and being conditioned again. And the whole process of history is a form of, implicitly or not, it's a form of eisegesis. A historian wills a part of himself in terms of his writing, in terms of his subject matter. Everything is conditioned, you can say, by this process of back and forth between the subject and the historical subject. It's a process again, and by future historians, this is by nature intersubjective or intuited by another being. Without this condition of sensibility, then those very determinations which we now represent to ourselves as changes would present to us a knowledge in which representations of time and consequently of changes would not appear. Again, everything has to be understood not just in terms of representation of time, but also in terms of representation of change. Again, it's why looking at Kant and trying to find an abstract notion of scientific knowledge, well, if all knowledge is conditioned by change and everything is conditioned in time, and time changes everything, how can we conceive essentially of the eternal? Then how can we thereby derive eternal laws? When you're coming to human action in particular, this becomes even more absurd, because at least within the whole basis of science, with science, you approach again a particular topic in order to be able to a case study, in order to derive certain useful data that can possibly essentially accrue from it. Within history, there is no ability to form closed systems of experimentation, no way of being able to ensure that one historical event will be the same and can be replicated. And as a result of that, every historical moment is a particular moment in time, not simply a aspect of a succession of events that can be repeated with certain accuracy. This whole notion of, again, the representation of time and being conditioned by time, and time being a fundamental component of the subjective mode of thought, is something which underpins everything in history. The empirical reality of time, therefore, remains as the condition of all our experience. And again, in terms of understanding time, he'll come back later in terms of the supersensible substratum, but it is both a subjective reality, but is also a reality underpinning everything that we can do and any knowledge that we can have derived historically. Absolute reality, according to what has been said above, cannot be granted it. Again, absolute reality, this notion that time is in some way beyond that of the subjective perceiver and can exist and be true of all time. Everything is conditioned by time in terms of our own understanding and relationship with history, with the object. Time is nothing but a form of our internal intuition. Again, what he means by that is that time can't be extrapolated outside of our own senses, outside of our own intuition. Everything we perceive is intuited again through a version of time, because understanding the absolute, the eternal, is again beyond our comprehension, especially when it comes to the whole mode of historical thought. Again, there is so much packed in here, and I'm only again having to quote certain segments and summarize the rest of the critique. If we take away from it the special condition of our sensibility, the conception of time also vanishes, and it inheres not in the objects themselves, but solely in the mind, also of the subject or the mind which intuits them. Again, you can take that and say that time is a form of extreme subjectivity, where the only thing essentially that exists is the sensible, the ability of our intuition to receive certain phenomena which present themselves, again, we can derive empirically, and we can attain a knowledge a posteriori. But how can we essentially say, therefore, that everyone has to perceive time equally, or time could be extrapolated, and that there could be another conscious being essentially who has the same perception of time that we have. And this is, you can say, the subjective conundrum. It then goes on in the idea of transcendental logic, of logic in general. Our knowledge springs from two main sources in the mind, the first of which is the faculty of power of receiving representations, receptivity of impressions, which we've gone into at some length. The second is the power of cognizing by means of these representations. Through the first, an object is given to us. Again, the whole basis of empirical knowledge. Through the second, it is in relation to the representation, which is the mere determination of the mind, of thought. Again, it's not simply that an object is received, the receptivity of impressions, but it has to be determined. It has to be cognized. So again, and even someone who is severely sort of mentally enfeebled, in order to even understand the concept of words, in order to cogitate anything, even in terms of being able to reference an aspect of reality, there has to be a form of mental activity. There has to be a process by which we have to understand and relate back to the world through our senses. Everything is done through this process of representation and cognition. Intuition and conceptions constitute, therefore, the elements of all knowledge, so that neither conception without an intuition in some way corresponding to them, nor intuition without conceptions can afford us cognition. Both are either pure or empirical. They are empirical when sensation, which presupposes the actual presence of the object, is contained in them, and pure when no sensation is mixed with a representation. Sensations we may call the matter of sensuous cognition. Pure intuition consequently contains merely the form under which something is intuited, and pure conception only the form of thought of an object. Only pure intuitions and pure conceptions are possible a priori, the empirically only a posteriori. Again, pure intuitions. The emphasis here, which is very clear, at least to me, is that these things do not exist in terms of pure segmented aspects of reality. Everything that we understand is based on the relationship between these two forces, a priori, a posteriori. In the sense, again, our whole knowledge of historical categories have to again reflect this whole notion of the back and forth between receiving events in history, say, for example, receiving knowledge of, I don't know, the Battle of Hastings, and been able to conceive essentially of what that means and what essentially that means in a grander historical narrative. All these things are only possible as a result of representation in our minds, being able to cognize matter, but also to have a conception of certain concepts in the world, more abstract, with which to essentially fit all these sense impressions into our categories. If you actually think about it, then again, it's very difficult to be able to put it in simpler language, but it represents such a fundamental, such a simple process of gathering data and being able to form historical impressions that, again, philosophically, there's no way almost to distill it at a more basic level than that, simply knowledge gathering and knowledge organizing. But at its most basic level, that's all historical knowledge is. We apply the term sensibility to the receptivity of our mind for impressions, insofar as it is in some way affected, and on the other hand, we call the faculty of spontaneously producing representations, or the spontaneity of cognition, understanding. And again, once we form an understanding, then we can have a basis for historical knowledge. Our nature is so constituted that intuition, which us never can be other than sensuous, that is, it contains only the mode in which we are affected by the objects. On the other hand, the faculty of thinking the object, of sensuous intuition, is the understanding. Neither of these faculties has a preference over the other. Without the sensuous faculty, no object would be given to us. Without the understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without but content are void. Intuitions without conceptions are blind. That is a very famous Kantian quotation, just to repeat. Thoughts without content are void. Intuitions without conceptions are blind. And again, if you're going to find the most sort of purest distillation of what I've really been trying to get at in terms of Kant, it exists there. Ontology, praxis, deduction, empiricism, being able to form concepts and being able to build it from content that we receive from our sensations, our sensibility to the world. And that again itself is a unique condition for each and every one of us, which is why, again, I emphasize that history is so creative. Because if you understand that it is based on the individual sensibility, then by every extension, every historian imbues a bit of themselves into every aspect of historical writing. He then goes on, in the general remarks on the transcendental aesthetic, the manifold conception in the self. The consciousness of self, apperception, is the simple representation of the ego, i.e. the self. And if by means of that representation alone, all the manifold representations in the subject were spontaneously given, then our internal intuition would be intellectual. What he means by the manifold, again, it's difficult really to describe in terms of the sort of English translation, because manifold has a slightly different interpretation compared to the literal translation that is meant here. But manifold, it simply literally means a plethora of potential sense impressions that form these representations. And together, this plethora forms a manifold. In order to have, again, any spontaneous understanding or intuition, to form an intellectual understanding, it is made up of so many forms of impressions. So, in terms of being able to understand any event in history, we have to approach it from the point of view of our own understanding of language, what we receive individually from the basis of language, from an aesthetic appreciation of any certain event that we're trying to cover. And indeed, anything that subconsciously or subconsciously enters the mind forms part of this grander conception of the manifold, the collection of these representations, which then spontaneously manifest and become the aspect of the intellectual world. That essentially is the essence of what it means to have a history in and of itself. A history is a manifold representation. This consciousness in man requires an internal perception of the manifold representations which are previously given in the subject, and the manner in which these representations are given in the mind without spontaneity must, on account of the difference, the want of spontaneity, be called sensibility. If the faculty of self-consciousness is to apprehend what lies in the mind, it must affect that and can in this way produce an intuition of self. Again, the apprehension, what lies in the mind, this whole notion again of spontaneity of these manifold representations to produce the object, to produce the concept. That, and being aware of that, at one point maybe I'm going to talk about Heidegger, talk about Dasein, and the whole nature of being, or has been sort of rendered being cognizant of being, obeying. You can say there is an analog to that in Kant's whole conception of the manifold representation, the manifold representations, which allow again a feeling of self-consciousness. I'm conscious of the fact that growing up, aspects of Kantianism, even though I couldn't necessarily, again, articulate it in the way that Kant has here, entered into what Tolkien actually refers to as the leaf mold of the mind. It's a phrase that I've always been enamored of, and try to use as often as possible. The manifold representation, the leaf mold of the mind. In some cases, you're not exactly aware of where certain elements of knowledge come from, or indeed why you have a particular fancy or judgment of that sect of knowledge, or why you attach a certain importance to it. But again, it's this spontaneous manifestation, this conception, this self-consciousness, the arrival at that certain idea, and again, trying to manufacture it, try to write it down, try to use it as a means of representing the wider world again. I know I'm repeating myself more often, but again, this all relates back to a fundamental premise in that is a history. The form of this intuition, which lies in its original constitution of the mind, determines in representations of time the manner in which the manifold representations are to combine themselves in the mind, since the subject intuits itself, not as it would represent itself immediately and spontaneously, but according to the manner in which the mind is internally affected, consequently, as it appears, and not as it is. The original constitution of the mind, again, all of these notions, spontaneous arrivals at certain manifold representations, these are all affected by time. You know, my writing or my appreciation of a certain event is always going to be conditioned by a particular set of experiences or sense perceptions, a sensibility at a certain time. You know, my whole understanding of history, especially of various topics, say for example Byzantium, is a rather sort of a brilliant example here. There are so many nuances and new factoids of information and arguments that I hear about Byzantium, even being able to say, for example, appreciate um, more about the Church Fathers. I referenced in a recent stream with Dawson the work of Eusebius, relating this back to Russian history and the idea of the Tsardom, even doing something as simple as learning more Greek. In this case, it would be Koine Greek, allow for a different spontaneous manifestation of these representations, which again, not only are they received in time, but the relative manifestations, the manifold, again, are conditioned within a certain time. And they're always, if you have a sense of the intellect, they're always recoalescing and remanifesting in the mind. And again, just to emphasize that I believe, the whole notion of, in terms of how the idea is represented outwardly, but again, the whole notion that there is a process of internal affection at the same time. That is the process of being able to have any sort of intellectual conception. Indeed, this is also something that I think frustrates the idea that I went back on Rankianism and history as it really is. Yes, it is a representation of manifold representations to a historian at any given time. There is a bit of the historian cast in that time which exists within that history, which, if again you're going to look at history as implicitly always a part of this eisegesis, willing yourself into the writing or the interpretation, even if you do so subconsciously. You're told as a child essentially that, oh, you can't be biased as a historian, biases are bad. By the very fact that you are receiving German history in the English language, you have a bias. Even if you go ahead and try and learn German, you have a bias because you're receiving German as a second language from the point of view of a foreigner. Even worse, if you're trying to understand German from any given point in time, you have a variation of language or understanding that has gone through evolution. It has developed since then. So this is why I think when first encountering Kant as a teenager, it came as such a revolution to me that it's all of these conditions from which knowledge can be coalesced and recoalesced, that a historical moment exists in that time and then it essentially ceases to exist. And the representation that everything essentially in history is a form of the actualization of a form of a series of representations. Um, and in that sense, again, history will never end. There is no definite history. There'll never be a definite history due to this essential fact. So moving on to the manifold and trying to synthesize a system of knowledge from the point of view of Kant. And this is in the subchapter of the pure conceptions of the understanding or categories. By the word synthesis, in its most general signification, I understand the process of joining different representations to each other and of comprehending their diversity in one cognition. Again, the whole notion of synthesis is essentially what I was simply then trying to describe. There was also a train of thought. He talks about thesis and antithesis elsewhere throughout the critique, and I think for the point of view of this particular study, it's been diluted by its, again, Fichtean and Hegelian interpretations here. But I think within this very specific category of a synthesis of understanding of all of these manifold representations, joining, comprehending. Again, another phrase I like from Kant, the diversity of cognition. Cognition will never be homogeneous in the sense there is simply what he was referring to earlier, a definite object that exists absolutely. The object that exists absolutely, which is inhuman, which can also exist outside of time, i.e., eternally, that again would be the homogeneous idea of an aspect of cognition. It wouldn't imply all of this diversity, these conditions. And as a result, for Kant especially, it simply cannot exist. The synthesis of a diversity is the first requisite for the production of a cognition, which in its beginning indeed may be crude and confused, and therefore in need of analysis. Still, synthesis is that by which alone the elements of our cognitions are collected and united into a certain content. Consequently, it is the first thing on which we must fix our attention if we wish to investigate the origin of our knowledge. Now that is the process I undergo every single time I encounter a historical topic. So a good example would actually be my understanding of the fall of the Soviet Union. I had, I would say, a very blinkered understanding of the fall of the Soviet Union, which I think was based on my own sense of incredulity as to how such a thing could happen. In other words, my understanding of the fall of the Soviet Union, despite, to my credit, being well acquainted with Russian history, was, I guess, by the standards of the argument that I was later able to produce, crude and confused. It relied a lot on an angle that Mikhail Gorbachev had destroyed the Soviet Union so successfully that he had to be a traitor to the Soviet Union in some regard, because essentially the Soviet Union dissolved itself. But I was able to collect so many elements, so many historical data points, to be able to form a very complex cognition of what it essentially meant to have that moment, the fall of the Soviet Union, which was predicated, you could say, around a completely revolutionary concept compared to what I just represented there. That Gorbachev was trying to revolutionize the Soviet Union in a way that appealed to the very basic principle upon which Lenin achieved power, which was all power to the Soviets. Stalinism, and to a lesser extent, the era of Brezhnev and the septuagenarian sort of gerontocrats who came to rule the Soviet Union, they represented, you can say, a mortified, a necrotic form of domination by the party, by the Secretariat, and by the Politburo. And what Gorbachev represented was not just an appeal to reform the Soviet Union, but to make the Soviet Union appeal to the basic mantra of Marxism, which is the universal consciousness of the proletariat as a worldwide revolutionary impetus. And thereby, the Soviet Union had to appeal to communist movements all across the world. Germany, for example, from the point of Gorbachev, was simply seen as a colony of the Soviet army. And the whole basis of the German Democratic Republic, you can say, was a stain on the appeal of communism all across the world. You'd had certain moments like the crushing of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, or the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968. It should be mentioned that at that time, Gorbachev was a member of Komsomol, the youth league, one of the major propaganda organs of the Communist Party. And so witnessing all of these form intellectual crises for communism, which were already apparent to the Soviet elite by the late 1970s, where the Brezhnev Doctrine was basically accepted to be a major detriment to the achieving of world communism by peaceful means, which essentially was the whole mantra of developed socialism. And so you can understand just from me reeling off those points, and then it again forms in the mind of Gorbachev that he is fighting that system. He is fighting that necrotic version of Stalinist Marxism-Leninism that has allowed the Soviet Union to deviate and become so, again, unattractive to democratic socialists and communists all across the world. He has to fight against that. That becomes his raison d'etre. All of his sort of political moves can be understood from that basic premise. Eliminating corruption, perestroika, reconstructing the Soviet Union, glasnost, forming an era of free information, reformation of the Soviet Union. that is such a advanced synthesis of certain elements of a process of historical understanding to create a history, that form of cognition, from that crude and confused matter, essentially, which I began with. So just listening again to that example, again, it seems so elementary when you think about it, that history all has to form a unitary synthesis. You could almost say that that is poetic in a sense. A lot of historians will, have great ammunition against the grand narrative. But for my purposes, at least, in order to have any granular understanding, there needs to be a matrix which is built essentially around a grand narrative, because without that synthetic unity, as Kant will refer to, then any sort of subsequent ideas that I derive from it, or hypotheses that I want to test on a smaller level, case by case basis, they are weakened as a result of that, because I don't have a understanding of the complete picture, let alone the smaller picture. And why, again, I think at the emphasis on Kant's understanding is there is a huge impetus towards intellectual growth and understanding so many variations and creative disciplines of humanity, because the more you limit your scope and understanding, the more essentially that your cognition is going to remain, if not crude, then exceptionally limited and of limited use to others. But continuing on, synthesis, generally speaking, the mere operation of the imagination, a blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we should have no cognition whatever, but of the working of which we are seldom even conscious. That's what I mean by it's partly a subconscious or even conscious process. This, you can say, is the whole basis of the whole idea of prejudice or received knowledge. I don't mean that to be prejudiced against prejudice. I simply mean that in the most literal sense of it being prejudice, before knowledge, before judgment. Even prejudices are received critically in Kant's philosophy, because again, even in terms of our basic abstracts of understanding, no matter how crude they can possibly be, everything has to go through a process of cognition in order to arrive at that, even if there is a definite degree of consciousness that is applied to more intellectual concepts, as opposed to those which are essentially received to a greater extent, but obviously not to a total extent, because that would be to refute Kant's underlying assumption here. But to reduce the synthesis to conceptions is a function of understanding by means of which we attain to cognition in the proper meaning of the term. So that, again, that's just a reformulation of everything that I've been saying. Pure synthesis, represented generally, gives us the pure conception of the understanding. But this pure synthesis, I mean that which rests upon the basis of a priori, synthetica, unity. This, on numeration, and this more observable in large numbers, is a synthesis according to conceptions, because it takes place according to a common basis of unity, for example, the decade. By means of this conception, therefore, the unity in the synthesis of the manifold becomes necessary. So what he means there in terms of the distinction between the synthesis and the manifold, and the whole notion of a priori synthetica, he's talking about the decade, he's talking about numbers. In terms of our own conception of time, we have to categorize them, we have to form conceptions. We say, for example, have to form a notion of the seasons, we have to form a notion of January before we can then apply to a concept of January that January is in winter, or January is cold. All of these things, you can say, were derived a posteriori, as opposed to an a priori conception of basic numbers, and then more sophisticated concepts that arrive from very basic mathematical language that allows us to form a cognition from which we can understand our world through a series of representations and categories. He then goes on to talk about synthesis to the idea of synthetic unity. In every cognition of an object, there is a unity of conception, which may be called qualitative unity, so far as by that term we understand only the unity of our connection of the manifold. For example, unity of the theme in a play, or a narration, or a story. It's actually what I was referring to earlier with the whole arc of a grand narrative of history essentially being a poetic quality. In order to, again, derive any value out of a narrative history, there have to be arguments. And if you're going to apply that to a literary application, because the lines between fiction and non-fiction are blurred, especially if you're going to form a history of literature, the theme becomes the argument, but also you require arguments in terms of being able to present a thesis in English literature. All of these things, even say, for example, oration, a story. Despite my sort of dulcet tones, again, the manner of my voice, the language I use, my method of conveyance, the language in which I'm presenting this, all are an aspect of this unity of conception of Kant's epistemology of history, which I'm trying to represent to you. That's why it's so all-encompassing. But on to Kant again. Secondly, there is truth in respect of the deductions from it. The more true deductions we have from a given conception, the more criteria of its objective reality. This is evidence. In terms of that analogy I brought back with the Soviet Union, the more pieces of evidence, again, I can use to substantiate that view, say, for example, the fact that it didn't simply represent a moment of, I don't know, mental absence from the point of Gorbachev to radically attempt to bring the Soviet Union back to its, you could say, idealistic roots, but it represented a train of thought that had been going on within the KGB, for example. Andropov, one of the predecessors of Gorbachev, wanted to reform the Soviet Union by purging corruption and by bringing in figures like Gorbachev, who they believed to be uncorrupted ideologues. Having more, again, elements of evidence and deductions, eyewitness accounts, testimonies, corroborating pieces of evidence, even analogies that you can draw. I mean, so much of the basis of my understanding of history is done through comparative analysis. I form analogies everywhere. I joke. Actually, it's appropriate because I think in many ways, Star Trek is based on the morality of Kant. But there we are. It's the Dharmok Jalat episode, which is its metaphor, its archetype, which is even more appropriate if you've been listening to my stream on Machair Eliade, where everything is referring back to the sacred, in that when enacting the archetype, when involved in the duel, the ritual of battle, whether involved in a mating ceremony, whether involved in a funeral, whether involved in a ritual to celebrate the harvest, whether it be in the process of scapegoating the sins of a community and externalizing them. All of these things you can say are, again, are data points from which we can understand any given society, and they represent an archetype. And again, it's from these archetypes that represent that subconscious notional representation. But for someone like Eliade, it'll go even further and say that these people believe not that, again, this was a intellectual process, but they were remanifesting every time an aspect of the sacred. But again, these are, to reduce it down to very basic criteria, these are data points for historical analysis. This we might call the qualitative plurality of characteristic marks which belong to a conception as to a common foundation, but are not cogitated as to quantify in it. So again, it's one thing to have a wonderful sort of panoply of information, before you, but compiling information is only an aspect of historical knowledge. You could be a great librarian and an antiquarian in compiling and preserving so much knowledge, but it's the raw matter. It's not simply the plurality. There needs to be an addition to this. And Kant comes back to this notion of there is perfection. And perfection consists in this, that the plurality falls back upon the unity of the conception and accords completely with the conception and with no other. In other words, the plurality of data points, which, again, the more data points you have in history, the better, because it's evidence. The more points of comparison, again, to strengthen your overall claims and arguments, the better. But again, perfection, aspiration to perfection is very clear to emphasize here. But again, the perfection is this overall argument, which, as a unique conception in and of itself, essentially represents a cohesiveness. It represents a whole. It represents a unity. And again, that analogy for history. Thus, we may denominate qualitative completeness. He then goes on in of the originally synthetical unity of apperception. The I think must accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me which could not be thought. In other words, the representation would either be impossible, or at least be, in relation to me, nothing. It's quite interesting, actually, understanding that people's ability to cognitize things in the abstract, it varies dramatically from person to person. If anything, again, this is further to dismantle the whole notion of the tabula rasa. The think has to vary, the representation has to vary from individual to individual. So, for example, I can conceive of images in my brain, very, very complex images. And again, I can form, concepts and words in my brain without essentially having to even write them down or vocalize them. That, again, is the process of thinking through the process of representation. On the other hand, there are people who can't even conceive colors in their brains. And again, this is why I think the subjectivity of aspects of Kant's thought is again important, because it's actually understanding the qualitative difference between the sensibility of people's, their ability to be receptive to certain sense impressions, and their ability to cognitize, to make a form, to make a aspect of qualitative completeness to all of these various data points to form a synthesis, which again improves the quality of the history. That representation, which can be given previously to all thought, is called intuition, again emphasizing the fundamental importance of intuition. All the diversity or manifold content of intuition has therefore a necessary relation to the I think in the subject in which the diversity is found. Everything is interrelated. But this representation, I think, is an act of spontaneity. That is to say, it cannot be regarded as belonging to mere sensibility. What he means by spontaneous is that, as I was referring to earlier, all of these notions and thoughts, they have to sort of manifest themselves as almost spontaneous eurekas, again, to use a sort of a Greek metaphor, almost, again, a secular conception of an epiphany, a constant series of epiphanies in the brain, because again, we wouldn't be able to understand thought if it was simply a process of mathematical enumeration. Everything had to be achieved through a mental process of simply adding up unrelated elements in order to come to a moment where there is that perfection, as Kant is referring to. There has to be an aspect of spontaneity. I believe, again, that's just simply a revelation, of course, of what's going on in Kant's mind, because this is by proxy, again, a reflection on Kant. If I'm going to be a historicist and I'm going to personalize and make this an intersubjective analysis, as Kant, say, for example, would be able to understand these fusions of various coalescing manifolds or data points of knowledge as a spontaneous realization. I think that's very true. Kant calls it pure apperception in order to distinguish it from empirical or primitive apperception. Again, he's always referring back to these concepts of, again, the distinction between non-historical knowledge, even though it applies, which is uh, ontologies without specific reference to data points. So, again, the laws of mathematics. There are other sort of data points that you can refer to, but I think maths, in terms of its implications, is the purest example you can point to in terms of finding these modes of apperception which aren't as empirically dependent on the process from which we are able to achieve data points in history. Because it is a self-consciousness which, whilst it gives birth to the representation, I think must necessarily be capable of accompanying all our representations. And again, if you don't have an ability to understand certain concepts, if you have what he refers to as a primitive apperception, if you lack intellectual volition, if you're unable to relate certain concepts together, there is a necessary aspect in order to allow for the diversity of all these representations to have some sort of spontaneous manifestation. Again, there is a qualitative difference between the perception, the sensibilities of some beholders of that information compared to others. It is in all aspects of consciousness, one and the same, and accompanied by it. No representation can exist for me. I think I'm just going to repeat that for my sake, if nothing else. I think must necessarily be capable of accompanying all our representations. It is in all acts of consciousness, one and the same, and accompanied by it. No representation can exist for me. What he essentially means by that, again, just trying to, sometimes again, I will read, and despite again having gone through this and out of all the critique picked out, I think the most significant points to be able to enumerate an argument, it's still very dense, especially when in these quotations I'm trying to sum up a huge extent of philosophical inquiry. But for me, as in pure capacity of a priori knowledge, that which is not reflecting, again, an empirical reality or within history, the intersubjective nature of historical knowledge, the unity of apperception, I call the transcendental unity of self-consciousness. Now, transcendental is a word that has sort of, again, different applications, you can say, within sort of Kant's understanding of thought. Again, transcendental idea essentially situated beyond that of the real world, beyond sense perceptions, transcendent. I, to my knowledge, don't have I would say a universal definition that Kant can use, because I believe he switches it up. But I think it's important to have that basic understanding of what transcendental means, to again exist beyond the empirical, beyond the self, beyond the idea of perception, and relate this back to his notion of idealism. The idea exists in the transcendental state within that certain aspect of the apperception of the mind. And I think this is the issue that a lot of people have in dealing with Kant. It's also the way I would say, I was misinformed about Kant when I was very young, which is idealism relates in German idealism, even though I'm not going to brush it all and say this is universal, the core, you can say, element of idealism, idea, is that it is the idea made manifest that is the reality, and that there is not necessarily a reality beyond the idea. And again, this leads to a notion where you have, there is sort of no necessary reality or metaphysical reality that exists beyond the phenomenon. Again, I'm summarizing a very, very complicated position, but that in itself leads to a point of view that because you can't intuit or understand an objective reality beyond the ideal, therefore it leads to a position of futility or intellectual skepticism. And Kant's purpose in writing the critique, as far as I can ascertain, is to try and rescue himself from that point of view. And so if there is an idealism, it has to be suspended into the transcendent realm of ideas, almost into, again, the Platonic series of realms. Otherwise, if we're going to apply idealism more universally, then it essentially uproots his entire purpose in writing the Critique of Pure Reason, because Kant is trying to discover the veins of possible modes of knowledge inferred from reason, not simply to write it all off and say that knowledge is impossible. And indeed, if that was the conclusion, if I held to that interpretation of idealism, then I would see essentially no value in anything that I produce from a historical point of view. And indeed, that's also a conclusion that some have come to. He then goes on in the subchapter, what objective unity of self-consciousness is. It is by means of the transcendental unity of apperception that all the manifold given in intuition is united into a conception of the object. You can say this is the projection into the Platonic theory of forms. On this account, it is called objective and must be distinguished from subjective unity of consciousness, which is a determination of the internal sense, by means of which the said manifold intuition is given empirically to be so united. Again, the object, the only thing I can reference again is mathematics, the concept of, one realm, one king, one army, one soldier, and having a idea of reality which is superimposed into the transcendent, which allows us again to have a reference point with which to engage with the sense perceptions that we infer as a result of our exposure, our particular subjective exposure to reality. And so essentially that is what is meant by objective. It's quite difficult again to appreciate that the objective can exist within the state of the mind. It's that there has to be an objective conception in order to have objectivity. For example, I'm a I used to listen to EFAP quite often because, as you would know from looking at Nathan Hood's channel, I was quite a big Star Wars fan, and a large part of, I would say, sort of Mauler's credibility on YouTube is established through his idea of objective critique. And again, I would say that part of his, again, appeal to the objective is to appeal to a transcendent idealism where there is a shared understanding or a conception of the objective which exists within his mind, despite, again, him being a subjective perceiver of the event. Again, Kant is trying to rescue such claims of objectivity from this point of view of nihilism. Again, I'm using a sort of example as to try and yeah, I am capable of not just talking in these abstract sort of philosophical notions without a point of reference that I think people can hopefully latch onto. So that is again what I think he means by that aspect of the transcendental unity of apperception arriving at the object internally, the object in the mind, the objective. But now we need to relate it to its relation of empirical manifestations of ideas. And he goes on to say, whether I can be empirically conscious of the manifold as coexistent or as successive depends upon circumstances or empirical conditions. Hence, the empirical unity of consciousness by means of association of representations itself to a phenomenal world and is wholly contingent. Wholly contingent, objective reality cannot simply exist transcendentally within the mind of the beholder. It always has to relate to a series of conditions, which allows the concept of the objective coincide essentially with the manifold. And this comes to the whole notion of causality. In science, we have causality, replication of results from which we can therefore accrue certain data points, which again talk about the plurality, the quantitative aspect of being able to ascertain a theory of knowledge. And it is from that, again, that we can draw objective empirical conclusions. But again, an important point that these, again, have to exist within a framework of understanding time. All of these things are, again, contingent. Moving on to Kant's second analogy of the time according to the law of causality, he will go on to say, how does this other representation go out of itself and obtain objective significancy over and above the subjective, which is proper to it as a determination of a state of mind? If we try to discover what sort of new property the relation to an object given to our subjective representations and what new importance they thereby receive, we shall find that this relation has no other effect than that of rendering necessary the connection of our representations in a certain manner and of subjecting them to a rule, and that conversely, it is only because a certain order is necessary in the relations of time and our representations that the objective significancy is ascribed to them. Again, it's scientific experimentation, replicatability of results. You have the ability for Kant in order to achieve a determination of the object based on all of these subjective representations and relations, these contingencies to the ability of the mind to cognitize certain sense data points. The desire, again, going back right to the beginning, of the perceiver not to look at the world as being pupil to master, but to be the judge, cross-examining the data points. The perceiver is trying to arrive at a position of knowledge, which can then in turn be objective within the mind of the perceiver. And that can only again be achieved by relating the pre-thought concept and again the desire to acquire knowledge, justified true belief. I think hopefully it should be made sort of more evidence as I go along how we can arrive at a position of justified true belief. True in terms again of these data points having some correlate or some reference again to a reality which isn't entirely subjective. There has to be an objective quality to truth. Justified in the sense again that you have all of these data points, but fundamentally also which would seem to undermine but also reinforce the ideas at the same time. Belief. It requires the subjective person to form an understanding and to relate all of these ideas and to hold the manifold manifestations, all of these things contingent at the same time. And that requires a certain sense of belief. I believe, therefore, that my conclusions are correct. It's not simply, again, from the point of Kant to say that I am necessarily receiving the truth passively. No, there is always an active interpretation of the evidence that's made manifest, and all of these things are contingent upon the representations that one is able to perceive in time. And therefore, we arrive at the position of an objective qualification within the mind, which of course for Kant, and we should also understand, is imperfect. If it were perfect, then it would be an absolute reality from which we cannot perceive from the point of view, again, of looking at this from the limitations of historical knowledge. In the synthesis of phenomena, the manifold of our representations is always successive. And what again he means by that, I want to come back again to why this is so important to history, is that there has to be this process of representation, more representation. It cannot be enough, especially in science, to look at the single event happening and to be able to draw definite laws or conclusions or any sort of grander data points. In many cases, you can look at an event, an individual event, and call them anomalies. Within history, of course, that becomes even harder. This is something I think a lot of people seem to not understand when it comes to the relationship between STEM and the humanities, is that history in some senses is harder than aspects of STEM because we do not have the ability to replicate our results in terms of our human subjects that STEM essentially has. That is the advantage. We are constantly trying to compensate for that advantage, for that disadvantage, but nevertheless, that's something we have to live with. And again, if you take a more skeptical understanding of the whole sort of theory from which we can gain any understanding of anything through the history of knowledge, it's this inability to be able to have this successive repetition of manifold representations that would seem to, again, inhibit the limits and potentialities of historical knowledge. But to my mind, that actually makes history all the more compelling and seductive, given the creative interpretations and again the fact that yes, I'm going to fall under the historian's tragedy, writing in our time, conditioned by that time, relegated to that time. But nevertheless, I will still read old historians because, if I decided to make that the object of my certain inquiry, all of these things would have value. But again, it's an intersubjective value. Um, but even then, with the whole basis of science, science operates in the same way. You know, with the whole sort of aspect of, say, for example, trying to form the atom bomb, that is a particular purpose that has to be derived from scientific principles. It is the human mind, the subjective interpretation of what purpose effectively is, driving that academic discipline that allows them to be able to form a understanding based on the repetitions of these successive events to arrive at a conclusion which they want to reach, which of course is the creation of the atom bomb. That's just one example. We then go on to the transcendental doctrine of the faculty of judgment. And this is tied to history and the need, again, to delineate categories of time and space in the particular and in the object, whether exist externally or whether exist in the mind. For the external sense, the pure image of all quantities, quantorum, is space. The pure image of all objects of sense in general is time. So again, when he's referring to quantorum object space, again, it comes back to this whole notion of mathematics, but it is the particular sense in general in time. The relationship again between the particular and the general, again, just trying to re-enumerate the sort of position I was going into earlier in terms of the abstract conception of the rules that we can have in mathematics and being able to form a general formula from which to apply them across a sequence of events. The pure schema of quantity, quantitatis, as a conception of the understanding, is number, a representation which comprehends the successive addition of one-to-one homogeneous quantities, and again, homogeneous with an asterisk, homogeneous in a way that we can understand something approaching but never reaching a state of absolute knowledge. Thus, the number is nothing else than the unity of the synthesis of the manifold in homogeneous intuition. By means of my generating time itself, my apprehension is by means of my generating time itself in my apprehension of the intuition. What he means by that is that he generates time from the simple act of progressing 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. There is that succession. It exists within his mind. He is also creating it because that is a subjective conditioning of his ability to be able to cognitize the notion of the passage of time. You know, the whole makeup of understanding, say, for example, that there are 60 seconds in a minute, talking about the whole notion of an hour, talking about 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, varying sort of roughly around 30 days for each month, corresponding with the lunar cycle. All of this is to emphasize that he is creating time in that sense. He's creating certain data points for which to form a reference, but at the same time, this number, this abstract notion of an object which exists as space, is the unity of the synthesis in the sense that, again, it's just trying to form an understanding from which to relate back to reality. Reality in the pure conception of the understanding is that which corresponds to a sensation in general, that consequently, the conception of which indicates a being in time. Again, it's a number is always a general indication. As I mentioned with the whole notion, like a country as a concept, it's always a general indication. You can use that in language. You can use that as, you know, a reference point in order to try and communicate certain concepts to other people, despite the fact, again, that you will have your own concepts bound up in that association with a country. You know, my understanding of what a country is going to be hugely at variance, I think, with a lot of lay people and their understanding of what it means, especially if you become more granular. You know, a country vis-a-vis the concept of a territorial unit or what a nation means. But nevertheless, it has to apply to something, and it applies to the sensation in general, i.e., that which is more or less true across a sequence of events with relative accuracy. And indeed, you can say it is the general application of that concept. In maths, of course, it becomes, you know, say, for example, I have two objects. One happens to be a glass of water, another happens to be a music stereo. Yes, they are two objects in the general, so the number of two therefore is valid. But in terms of the actual relationship that these two objects, or any sort of value that we can ascertain from that, there's a huge gulf and difference that's represented by that. So on a very abstract level, again, the whole notion of numbers is the most concrete example of this, but as you can use with historical concepts, the whole basis of broader historical concepts is being able to indicate general understanding. But with the whole notion of history, I will come against the notion of general rules. I will always push back against general rules in history. We can point to trends, things which are indicative, repeating patterns, and this again can form a very broader sense of the general. But my own understanding of history and being able to relate history is to rely less on the general, less on a mathematical conception of historical conceptions, and ever more on the particular. Because the particular, again, trying to unpack the notion, you know, what essentially is the fundamental qualitative difference between the two objects, is again why history, as a microcosm of everything, you know, all histories are microcosms in the sense that they are focused on a certain thing, but that thing, by nature relating to humanity, is also a universal phenomenon at the same time, even if it be a biography. It's just a category of understanding. History vis-a-vis science is separated in the fact that, unlike mathematics, the applications for the general are far less applicable. Applications for the general are far less. I'm trying to find a way of describing this, but again, it's quite hard for me to enumerate these concepts. It should be mentioned also that I wasn't planning on going on this long in terms of being able to explain this concept. I was actually I still have around 70 people here, so you're very patiently listening to me trying to unpack all of these concepts from Kant. But nevertheless, it's very much appreciated that you're here for the journey. I was only expecting the stream to last for about an hour. As time is only a form of intuition, as previously stated as to why, consequently of objects as phenomena, that which in objects corresponds to sensation is the transcendental matter of all objects in things in themselves, and that essentially represents their reality. Again, transcendental matter, the objects as things in themselves. Again, reality is got sort of so many asterisks next to it. But if you're going to understand again the object as being the objective, something that has to represent a reality, it has to be conditioned by all of these interrelations. And then he goes on to say, the schema of substance is the permanence of the real in time. That is, the representation of it as a substratum of the empirical determination of time, a substratum which therefore remains while all else changes. This is an allusion to the supersensible substratum. Supersensible in the sense that, like the superego, it is something which exists to the greatest possibility that it can within our senses. Yet it is superimposed in a way that it forms a groundwork for our understanding of all forms of knowledge without us even necessarily being aware of it, in terms of my sort of understanding of it. And if you're going to come with up the idea of substance and the whole idea of representation and things being true of certain instances within time, that essentially is trying to construe a sense of empirical relations and substances, but emphasis on time passes not, but it passes the existence of the changeable. To time, therefore, which is itself unchangeable and permanent, corresponds that which is the phenomena is unchangeable in its existence, that is substance, and it is only by that the succession and coexistence of phenomena can be determined in regard to time. So again, the object in a transcendental realm superimposed outwards, but the whole progress of time is that even though we try and talk about substance, permanence, the real, what does that mean? Because all of these things are empirically determined within time, everything is a process of changing. All of our data points are a process of changing. That's, again, the whole process of history, is understanding how everything is conditioned and formed in relation, not just to other people and other minds, but also in relation to time. And this is why we're going to talk about, over the weekend, Spengler and his relationship with history and Kant, is that Kant's conception of history is again about the changeable. And to Spengler, what history is the process of becoming. My addition to that would be history is the process of becoming. It is also the process of never becoming, because history will, again, unless you believe essentially in the Christian view of history, history is, in a very crude sense, one thing after another. And so it will always appear again that history will reach a point of manifesting into some sort of, I don't know, authentic reality. Like, I don't know, the conception of a state or the conception of an ideal form of government or whatever. But it's always a process of never becoming, because these things are always changeable, yet because they will never reach a perfect state and therefore remain permanent of all time or represent an absolute reality. It is therefore a state of never becoming. The scheme of cause and of causality of a thing is real, which when posited is always followed by something else. Again, this is what is meant by everything is necessarily involved in a system of succession, even if the mind creates the data points from which to understand the whole basis of succession. It consists, therefore, in the succession of the manifold, in so far as the succession is subjected to a rule. Again, as I meant, that all sort of knowledge in the manifold is the recoalescing of these spontaneous data points into new forms of knowledge. But for science, the whole process of causality is trying to form a basis from which we can have replication of results. It's actually interesting, again, even though it wasn't necessarily what was going to be covered last Sunday, was the difference between determination and causality, which I believe is very important. Determination, as with determination historicism, which I reference that subtle distinction. Causality means that we see a succession, and because we can see a succession, we can try and imply that there is a underlying reality, the schema of substance. There is a substance there, that we can thereby ascribe a substance or a rule based on the nature of causality. But given the limitations of human sense perception, if we begin, therefore, to say that that is deterministic, that is true of all time, then you may have established a system of justified true belief, but it is necessarily a system of belief. It is not necessarily true. And so if you essentially, fall behind, talk about the Greek conception of the classical elements, and then you're moving towards the periodic table, what was originally subjected to a rule has now been superimposed by an entirely new sequence of being able to understand and engage with chemistry, with the study of matter. Again, because I'm not a scientist, in terms of trying to understand the whole historical progression, it might actually be interesting to talk about the system of archetypes. If archetypes are referencing back to the sacred, and the sacred is always referencing back to the system of the gods established on Earth, then it is to be expected that this will go on forever, and that it is the rule of the sacred that these events have to occur in a certain way, that it is prescriptive for a form of human action. But the minute, again, essentially, that a human being breaks away from that, expresses individuality, rebels against that, then the rule is broken. Hence, causality versus determinism. And this goes on nicely to the next point. The schema of community, reciprocity of action and reaction, or the reciprocal causality of substance in respect of their accidents, is the coexistence of the determinations of the one with the other according to a general rule. Again, everything has to exist within this, as knowledge is based on this reciprocation between deductive and inductive reasoning, between the mind and the sense perceptions regarding a reality which formed the basis of sensibility. So causality has to be a system of reciprocation in order to perform a general rule or a law. The schema of possibility is the accordance of the synthesis of different representations with the conditions of time in general. As, for example, opposites cannot exist together at the same time in the same thing, but only one after the other. And it is therefore the determination of the representation of a thing at any time. Again, talk about the sort of notions of possibilities, and this is almost like thinking of history in the quantum realm. It's not simply looking at events as necessarily having to have happened in a certain way, but any certain projection of the future requires the ability to see a sequence of potential events in front of you. These can be, again, their determinations. They're our ability to represent potential outcomes in our own mind. And so they can all be equally true and not true. We can only sort of determine that in terms of the basis of what comes afterwards. And I think, again, within history, the results of being able to accurately predict the future are incredibly fraught, and I will never ever claim to do so. But nevertheless, you can perhaps draw general trends and preferences to certain outcomes without, again, trying to accord this, say, for example, to the principles of something far more regular, like the principles of gravity. even though gravity is a nuanced topic in and of itself, so it's not a perfect analogy there. But I like the idea again that because the whole synthesis of representations leads to a whole series of historical events in time that can present factual sequences of events and counterfactuals. Is something I think is very important in terms of understanding history, is understanding the possible histories, and not just in terms of the writing of certain histories in terms of the events and sequences that happen, but in terms of the sequence of events that did not occur, but were representing a reality to those engaged in said events, and so represent a reality onto themselves. Again, the more you think about this, it seems very complicated, but it's necessary. It's necessary for understanding a sort of complete mode of historical thought. All of these interrelations between the mind and reality. He then goes on to say, Kant, the schema of reality is existence in a determined time. Determined time, emphasis again that these are all things, it's essentially a point of arrested development. We've seized upon a time, the alarm clock has sort of gone off, or the stopwatch has ended, and that is our best appraisal of reality. The schema of necessity is the existence of an object in all time. And this is why, determinism becomes such a fraught category. In terms of being able to understand a rule, there has to be a presupposition that an object will effectively affect a certain result over and over again, and thereby it has an existence or a substance which can necessarily, again, be held to be true of all times. But within categories of science and historical knowledge, again, that is can be applied with varying results, so to speak. The schema of necessity is the existence of an object in all time. It is clear from all this that the schema of the category of quantity contains and represents the generation, synthesis of time in itself, in a successive apprehension of an object. The schema of quality, the synthesis of sensation with the representation of time or the filling up of time, the schema of relation of perceptions to each other in all time. And finally, the schema of modality and its categories, time itself as the correlative of the determination of an object, whether it does belong to time and how. Again, that sounds like Kant is known for his very sort of arduous and convoluted statements, but I actually think, in terms of relation to other long sentences done by Kant, that is a very apt description of how the basis of essentially of historical knowledge is you able to arrive at, and emphasis again successive apprehension. When you create a history, not only are you apprehending the event within time, but you're also apprehending your own state of apperception of an event within time. This is how you have interpreted an event, you have arrested an event in order to establish a history. You've also arrested your own understanding of an event within time and within history. Again, the more you think about it, again, the more that Kant's analysis seems to have accounted for all of these potential, again, complications that can arise for the perceiving of history and the capacity for historical knowledge. And this, again, is why I have to emphasize that regardless of what else I think about Kant, in terms of my, obviously, because this isn't a written thing, this is a stream trying to go over this. And like I said, I wasn't planning on going on for this long. My no doubt sort of flawed, spontaneous manifestation of a synthetic unity of how I appreciate Kant. It's just all the more interesting, again, that the more you think about the implications of what he's saying, the more relevant and applicable it comes to understanding the writing of history, despite how granular and how pedantic you can become. And again, this is so important in terms of being able to understand this consciously. A lot of people write history unconsciously. They're not aware of all of these relations and categories of knowledge and understanding. But how can it not, again, help to be able to understand these relations and be cognizant of them when you're writing and appraising the whole process of history? And in conclusion on this point, the schemata, therefore, are nothing but a priori determinations of time, according to rules, and these in regard to all possible objects following the arrangement of the categories relate to the series in time, the content in time, the order in time, and finally to the complex or totality in time, which again is just another way of referencing and trying to solidify all these points that I've been trying to bring up pre-Kant. We then go on to of the principles of all synthetic judgments. If a cognition is to have objective reality, that is to relate to an object and possess sense and meaning in respect to it, it is necessary that the object be given in some way or another, as in be a given phenomena. Without this, our conceptions are empty, and we may indeed have thought by means of them, but by such thinking we have not in fact cognized anything. We have merely played with representation. Again, you have to establish given facts in order to begin the process of cognition. Again, there's a lot of repetition in Kant, but all of this is to belabor a central point. To give an object, if the expression be understood in the sense of to present the object, not mediately, but immediately in intuition, means nothing else than to apply the representation of it to experience, but that experience real or only possible. Again, perhaps a subtle distinction. Immediate, not through a process of mediation, through intuition, relating again to the object in terms of the immediacy of perception, as opposed to a mediated reality in relation to other phenomena, external sense impressions, experience. Again, all these terms, again, you have to sort of link them together in terms of a grand sort of overarching philosophy for Kant. And I think that link between immediacy and mediation is quite significant here. Space and time themselves, pure as these conceptions are, from all that is empirical and certain, as if it is that they will perceive represented fully a priori in the mind, will be completely without objective validity and without sense and significance if their necessary use in the objects of experience were not shown. Again, this is what is meant by the whole idea that space and time have to exist in order for us to have any sort of basis of understanding of knowledge existing within the categories of space and time. Yet also, in order to establish these as objective facts, it's simultaneously beyond our ability to definitively comprehend as to why that would even be the case, given the limited mode of our ability to form representations of reality. Nay, the representation of them in a mere schema that always relates to the reproductive imagination, which calls up the objects of experience without which they have no meaning. Like I said, everything has to constantly relate to the applications of time and space, the applications of historical knowledge. And it's why all of my conceptions of history always have to be contextual, and why, again, I emphasize such a historicist understanding. If these things aren't, again, related or contextualized within space and time, they have sort of no historical validity. And it is so with all conceptions without distinction, again, just underlying the basis of the possibilities for historical knowledge. The possibility of experience is then that which gives objective reality to our a priori cognitions. Now, experience depends on the synthetical unity of phenomena, that is, upon a synthesis, according to conceptions of the object of phenomena in general, a synthesis without which experience never could become knowledge, but would be merely a rhapsody of perceptions, never fitting together into any connected text, according to rules of a thoroughly united possible consciousness, and therefore never subjected to the transcendental and necessary unity of a perception. Again, I like the phrase rhapsody of perceptions. In terms of, again, writing a philosophy, that would be fluff. But in terms of writing philosophy, in terms of engaging with an audience, and also in terms of writing history, it's not simply enough to be able to present an argument very convincingly. Part of the whole point of convincing is being able to appeal to the pathos of the audience, not simply the logos. And so being able to conjure up an expression, a logic with words which is allowed to essentially seduce the reader to your point of view. I know that sounds rather insidious, but nevertheless, uh, unless you're doing so again with the ability to create sophistry, false arguments with which to trick the reader, so long as you're not doing that, it is a necessary evil, but again, a fundamental part of the creative process. Experience is therefore, for a foundation, a priori principles of its form, that is to say, general rules of unity in the synthesis of phenomena, the objective reality of which rules as necessary conditions, even of the possibility of experience, can always be shown in experience. Because time and because space are always demonstrated in our concepts and phenomena, because they are so constant, even though they are subjectively inferred through our experiences, we can form a basis of a priori principles from them. Yes, it's a process of give and take. We do not receive these things from on high. This isn't an epiphany from God demonstrating that these form the basis of a general rule in terms of understanding or knowledge, in this case, historical knowledge. It actually comes back to the point made earlier regarding time, and that everything is an apprehension of time in more senses than one. If you begin to think about this seriously, again, I'm not sure whether this actually applies to anyone apart from me, but maybe at one point you've had this moment that because every moment in time vanishes, it dies, never to be repeated again. It can essentially form a bit of an existential crisis to the point that every moment vanishes, never to be repeated again. But again, Kant solves this problem in the sense that, yes, that is the case to some extent. Nothing is ever repeated. Every moment essentially is dead and never to be repeated again. But we have to understand and appraise knowledge in the world through a conscious process of apprehension in time. Indeed, this isn't simply an intellectual process. Apprehending a moment in time is necessary in order really for anyone to have a faith that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that they will get up and they won't simply fall through the floor into a bottomless chasm or abyss. All of these things are necessary in terms of being able to even survive. Yes, we don't have the veritas, the verisimilitude that can emerge from an epiphany, a God's eye knowledge into the world of how things really are in an absolute system of things. But our apprehension of time is the best way with which we can form a modality, a mode of thinking in which to encounter reality. And by the way, people, to those of you 70 or so listening, do ask me questions as I go along. If anything, it helps me as much as it would help you in terms of being able to focus certain points in argument based on a point of reference, which I'm trying to do with various historical examples. Now, this is the final point I want to bring in with Kant. Our apprehension of the manifold in a phenomenon is always successive. It is consequently always changing. By it alone, we could therefore never determine whether the manifold or an object of experience is coexistent or successive, unless it had for a foundation something that exists always, that is, something fixed and permanent, of the existence of which all succession and coexistence are nothing but so many modi of time. Only in the permanent, then, are relations of time possible. That is to say, the permanent is the substratum of our empirical representation of time itself. Hence why I was referring to the substratum. You may have thought I was joking, but it is actually integral to Kant's mode of understanding, in which alone all determinations of time are made possible. Permanence is in fact just another expression for time, as the abiding correlate of all existence of phenomena, and of all change, and of all coexistence. For change does not affect time itself, but only the phenomena that exist in time. If we are to attribute succession to time itself, we would be obliged to cogitate another time in which this succession would be possible. It is only by means of the permanent that existence in different parts of the successive series of time receives a quantity with which we entitle a duration. For in mere succession, existence is perpetually vanishing and recommencing, and therefore never has even the least quantity. That's what I mean earlier about the existential crisis. If you think about this, too deeply without trying to find a remedy to it and falling into this pitfall of extreme skepticism. Without the permanent, then, no relation to time is possible. Now, time in itself is not an object to perception. Consequently, the permanent in the phenomenon must be regarded as the substratum of all determination in time, and consequently also as the condition of the possibility of all synthetical unity of perceptions, that is, of experience, and all existence and all change in time can only be regarded as a mode in the existence of that which abides unchangingly. Therefore, in all phenomena, the permanent is the object in itself, that is the substance, but all that changes or can change belongs only to the mode of existence of this substance or substances, consequently to its determinations. And to finish, these are mere forms of thought, which contain only the logical faculty of uniting a priori in consciousness the manifold given in intuition. So the historical mode of knowledge is a form of knowledge, one that I believe finds a concreted expression in Kant's philosophy. But when, say, for example, coming to the capacity for epiphany, for religious knowledge, in terms of my own understanding, say, for example, in terms of engaging with something like a grand theology of history, in terms of, say, for example, engaging with Summa Theologica, is something that I've gone back and forth, but again, it's just one of these topics where I think it fundamentally represents a different mode of thinking compared to that which I'm used to expressing on this channel, and which I'm essentially, I would say, of most use to you. It's not simply one in which I'm most comfortable. It's one because I am the most comfortable in terms of expressing myself through this particular mode of historical thought, as I've, again, tried to elucidate through using Kant. I could be of use to you. I can produce something of value and serve as a source of education. I feel that deviating too much away from this is, again, entreating potential ruin by standing on untested ground. You know, I'm so used to seeing history as a process of eisegesis that in coming to a subject that requires the closest thing possible to pure exegesis, which I believe is almost fundamentally impossible based on everything that's been said, I have the liability to fall the farthest, so to speak. But anyway, thank you for listening. Like I said, I was only planning on speaking for half that length. And hopefully you can appreciate that if I prefaced a talk on how can Kant be remedied with a reactionary viewpoint, and I prefaced it with this, I don't think any of you would have survived. Nevertheless, as I can see from the last comment I received, everyone has been very politely listening for the last hour and 10 minutes. So there's very little in terms of me being able to go back through the various comments and respond to them because I haven't received any, which is a new thing really for this channel. I'll stick around for a minute or two, but unless you have any particular questions, I'm going to call it a day. Like I said, I was planning on there being a bit of a Q&A because these are very, very complex questions. And in terms of me being able to express this in this way, ad hoc, obviously it's, you know, far, far from perfect, but it's at least the closest that I can sort of form in terms of how I utilize Kant as effectively as I can. Nicholas Bari has broken out and has shone through as the first comment in the last hour and 10 minutes, ameliorated my view of Kant quite a bit. Well, the unfortunate thing is, Nicholas de Bari, is that this is the part of Kant where I can ameliorate him the best. I can, like I said, it's a due I owe Kant. I feel I'm in debt. And if I'm going to do a conversation going over his views on the Enlightenment or his views on teleology or his views on universal history, because notice how I haven't actually engaged with these arguments, and that's because I can't remedy them to my own form of historical thought. Hence why I preface this. This is the value of Kant to my understanding of historical knowledge. I can't exonerate Kant in many other areas, nor do I care to. But thank you, everyone. Because I haven't received any other comments, I'm going to call it there. Just to say thank you, everyone, for listening. Good night. And please check out the stream on Saturday, a reactionary reading of Kant. Thank you very much.